Welcome to the Power in Excellence podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Power in Excellence podcast and to episode 2 of our special series, The Unseen Advantage, the series in which we're exploring the secret psychology of leadership. I'm John McMahon, leadership psychologist and executive coach. For over 2 decades, I've worked with C-suite executives, boards, and senior teams from around the world and across industries. In this series, I'm sharing with you the secrets of successful leadership that most management programs and books don't dare to touch. In our first episode, we explored the inner leader, the stories, needs, nervous system patterns, and emotional inheritance that shape how you show up under pressure. We ended with a simple but confronting truth: before you lead others, you're always leading yourself. Today, we step outward, because leadership doesn't only live inside you. It lives in the minds of others. It lives in perception. In this episode, we explore a reality that most leaders at best underestimate. Leadership isn't only about what you do. Leadership is about what other people believe you're doing. And that means if you don't understand perception, you don't really understand leadership. So today we ask, why does leadership live in other people's heads? And how do people decide, often in milliseconds, whether to trust you, follow you, believe you, or resist you? I'll be right back.
Great leaders aren't born, they're built. The Power in Excellence podcast with Dr. John reveals the psychology behind influence, confidence, high performance, and human behaviour. No fluff, just powerful insights you can use immediately to lead better, think clearer, and perform at a higher level. Follow now and level up.
Most leaders assume, because it's what they've learned, it's what they've been taught, that leadership is something that they do. They believe that if I communicate clearly, if I set direction, if I make decisions, if I manage performance, then leadership exists. But psychologically, leadership isn't primarily action. It's attribution. People observe your behavior, they interpret meaning, they assign motives, and they build a mental model of who you are. And that model becomes your leadership. In psychology, this is called social attribution theory, the process by which people explain other people's behavior by attributing traits, intentions, competence, and character. And that means that, unfortunately, you don't get to decide who you are as a leader. Other people do. Of course, you can influence it, but you can't fully control it. And that's why 2 leaders can behave absolutely identically and be perceived entirely differently. One might be experienced as confident and the other as arrogant. One might be seen as calm and the other as detached. One could be seen as being decisive and the other as being impulsive. Same behavior, different perception. And perception, as we know, becomes reality. I once worked with 2 senior executives in the same organization. They were both super smart, really intelligent people, both highly experienced, very strategic thinkers, and extremely competent. One was described as a natural leader, and the other was described as kind of hard work to deal with. When we looked into it, the difference wasn't expertise. The difference was really only in micro-behavior. One made lots of eye contact and paused before answering, and the other spoke fairly quickly and had a tendency to interrupt. One asked fairly curious questions before giving an opinion, where the other one moved immediately into offering solutions and guidance. The first was perceived as being thoughtful and confident, and the second as being impatient and controlling. Neither of them intended this, but leadership lives in perception. So we need to talk about something that's quite unsettling for many leaders. People decide whether to trust you faster than you think, faster than you would like. Psychological research on thin slicing shows that humans form surprisingly accurate impressions of other people based on a very small sample of behavior, sometimes in seconds, in milliseconds even. And we do that by reading Things like tone of voice, posture, facial expressions. We judge the energy level. We look at the amount of eye contact that the person makes. Are they pacing or not? Before your strategy is even heard, before you even get a chance to demonstrate how smart and intelligent you are, or tell people about your wonderful, unblemished track record, your nervous system has already been read and judged. And your leadership credibility has already been scored. And this matters because many, if not most leaders, focus on what they say. But people don't experience the what first. People first experience how you say it. Your presence arrives before your content. And in leadership, presence is persuasion. I remember a newly appointed executive once told me, I feel like my team has already decided who I am, and I think they've already decided that I'm not the right person. I was lucky enough to attend one of his very first town hall meetings, and he was very good. His words were great. He said all the right things. He was clear. He was logical, and he was strategic. Fantastic. Except that his posture was very rigid. His breathing was shallow because he forgot to breathe. You know that way when you take in a big deep breath and you start speaking, and then you breathe in again and you start speaking, and you keep speaking, but you keep taking a little intake of breath each time. So in the end, your chest is really full and you forget to breathe out. And that makes your voice really tight. And his voice was very tight on this occasion. His nervous system was broadcasting anxiety. Within just a few minutes, the audience had picked up this signal and they understood this leader is under threat. And that translated to them as, this leader might not be safe to trust. I'm pretty sure that nobody in the room said it out loud. Probably very few people actually consciously thought it. But I guarantee you, the vast majority of them felt it. Perception always arrives first. Human groups evolved around status hierarchies long before organizations existed, millennia ago. And yet to this day, we are exquisitely sensitive still to status signals. We're very good at judging the situation. In every interaction, people subconsciously track who speaks first, who interrupts, who holds eye contact, who's deferring and deflecting, who's taking up space, who apologizes, who's claiming certainty, and who hesitates. And all of the work that I've done across the world shows me that this is not culture specific. It's wired deeply into social perception. Leadership presence is built partly through status behaviors and often unconsciously. For example, speaking slowly increases perceived authority. Staying quiet increases perceived confidence. Asking questions increases perceived intelligence. And rushing decreases perceived control. And this doesn't mean playing dominance games. It means recognizing that leadership is constantly being read through subtle behavioral signals. And if you're unaware of what you signal, that doesn't matter because other people will still interpret it. And they may not interpret it the way you intended. I remember many years ago, a deputy CEO of a company I was working with was very quiet in meetings. He spoke far less than everybody else in the room. But when he did speak, and we always knew when he was about to speak because he cleared his throat and shuffled his position in his chair. So everybody knew, and everybody silenced. And the room leaned in and waited. And they waited because he had waited. He waited and he listened. He allowed others to finish. And when he finally offered his view, my goodness, it landed. He held high status, not through force, not through interrupting, not through talking over people or talking louder than other people, but through presence. And presence is perception embodied. So here's a leadership danger zone. You know your intent, but other people only experience your impact. We judge other people by their behavior and impact, and we judge ourselves by our intention. But intention is not the same as impact. In psychology, this is called actor-observer bias. You explain your own behavior by circumstances and good intention. Other people explain your behavior by personality and motive. So you might say something like, well, I only interrupt because we were short of time. What they experience and what they interpret is, he doesn't respect my input. You might say something like, I challenge because standards really matter to me. What they experience is, she's critical and unsafe. And that gap between intention and impact is one of the biggest sources of leadership breakdown. And most leaders, unfortunately, never close it because they never step into the perceptual world of others. Inner leadership, from episode 1, was about self-awareness. Perceptual leadership is about other awareness. Before your next big meeting, ask yourself, if I watched myself from the outside, what would I assume about this leader? That might be a slightly uncomfortable question, but it's a very powerful one. Perception doesn't just reflect reality. It shapes it. When people perceive you as confident, they give you more leeway. And when they perceive you as trustworthy, they take more risk with you. And those responses improve your effectiveness. And this creates a self-reinforcing loop. Perception leads to behavior, which leads to response, which reinforces perception. And of course, the opposite is also true. If you're perceived as being unsafe, people will withhold truth. If you're perceived as being unpredictable, people will avoid risk. If you're perceived as controlling, people will disengage, and performance declines, thereby confirming their perception. This is why leadership perception is not cosmetic. It's causal. A senior leader I worked with was perceived as being brilliant but impossible. So we decided to focus on some small perceptual shifts. We coached him on speaking more slowly, asking one question before giving an opinion, and acknowledging emotion at least once per meeting. Within months, people described him as still sharp, but he's now approachable. Same intelligence, same decisiveness, different perception, and crucially, different leadership. Most leadership communication training focuses on clarity of message, but communication fails far more often due to misread signals than unclear content. Because humans don't listen neutrally. We listen through our own biases and prejudices, our past experiences, our power dynamics, our trust levels, the emotional safety that we perceive, and perceived intention. And that means that your message is filtered through their perception of you, through all of their biases and prejudices. If they perceive you as unsafe, they will hear threat. If they perceive you as dismissive, they will hear disregard. If they perceive you as being trustworthy, they will hear possibility. And that's why two leaders can say exactly the same thing and get two very different responses. In episode 1, we explored how your inner world shapes your leadership. And we're now encountering the mirror image of that, how other people's inner worlds shape how they perceive you. And this is crucial and often humbling because you're not perceived objectively. You're perceived through the psychological filters of other people. Every person you lead brings with them their past experiences with authority, their fears and hopes, their trust history, their biases, their prejudices, their cultural expectations, and their unmet psychological needs. And all of that quietly colors how they interpret you. And this is called projection. Projection means that people often experience not only who you are, but who they expect authority to be. A leader who is calm may be perceived as reassuring by one employee and as emotionally distant by another. A leader who's decisive may be perceived as confident by one team and controlling as another. Same behavior, different internal worlds. And that means that perception is not only about your signals, it's also about the lens through which other people are looking. And wise leaders learn to ask not only, how am I showing up, but also, what might be projecting onto me? A newly appointed senior manager once told me, everybody says I'm really intimidating, but I'm really not, I'm just quiet. And when we explored a wee bit further, we discovered that his predecessor had been extremely authoritarian and punished mistakes. So when he showed up and spoke a lot less, listened more intently, and didn't fill the silence, they projected their old fear onto him. Once he understood this, though, he was able to adjust his behavior slightly, and he smiled a little bit more, he named his intention, and sometimes would say things like, guys, silence just means that I'm thinking, I'm not judging. The perception shifted. Not because his personality changed, but because the projection was interrupted. This is perceptual leadership. So we have to address something now that influences every single leader, consciously or not. Bias. We use lots of mental shortcuts to help us to navigate complex social environments. In psychology, we call these heuristics, or cognitive miserliness. And we use them because they serve us well. They save time, they conserve cognitive energy, but they also distort perception. Common perceptual biases include things like confirmation bias, where we look for and we see evidence that supports existing beliefs. The halo effect, where we allow one positive trait to influence future judgments. Or the opposite of that is the horn effect, where we allow one negative trait to influence future judgments. In similarity bias, we trust those who look and feel familiar, and in authority bias, we defer to perceived power. This means that a leader who may have been perceived as confident early days will have all future behavior filtered positively. A leader who might have been seen as difficult early on will also have any future behavior dismissed. Perception hardens into reputation, and it's often unfair. And reputations, once formed, are surprisingly resistant to change. And that means that early leadership moments carry disproportionate weight. First impressions aren't everything, but they're also not nothing. A senior executive once told me, I lost them in the first presentation. He rushed it. He spoke too fast. He overloaded his slides. His slides were a mess. They were just a wall of words. And he was so nervous that he avoided eye contact with anybody in the room. And the audience understood that as being not confident. And that not confident translated into not trustworthy. 6 months later, despite excellent work, he was still described as pretty much the same. Perception had crystallized. And slowly, over time, we managed to change that through pace, breathing, presence, silence, not just in presentations, but in meetings overall. And perception changed, but only through consistent new signals every single time. Perception is sticky, but not permanent. When people encounter a leader, we unconsciously ask 3 questions. Are you competent? Are you trustworthy? And do you care about people like me? And these questions are asked instantly, silently, and unconsciously. If competence is missing, confidence drops. If trustworthiness is missing, vigilance rises. If care is missing, disengagement follows shortly afterwards. Leadership credibility is the composite answer to these 3 questions. And notice that those 3 questions about competence, trustworthiness, and care, none of them asks about your strategy. None of them asks about your qualifications or your CV or your resume. Of course, those things matter. They matter later because what comes first is perception. A leader I coached was described as being brilliant but cold. His competence was unquestionable. He was fantastic. And his trustworthiness was decent. It was okay. But his care signal was low. He never asked personal questions. He'd never acknowledged emotion. He never checked how people were experiencing things. In his mind, he was being efficient and respectful. He didn't ask personal questions because he didn't want to pry. He thought it was nosy and inappropriate. In his mind, he was doing all the right things. Other people's perception of him was that he was indifferent and he didn't care. So we introduced one small behavior. At the start of meetings, he started asking things like, "How's the workload feeling this week? How's everybody doing?" Nothing else changed, but just that very simple, small behavior. About 6 weeks later, the phrase that was used to describe him had shifted. Surprisingly human was what people said. They still described him as being brilliant, but they now also described him as being surprisingly human. Perception changed through tiny signals. One of the most difficult leadership moments is discovering how I see myself is not necessarily how other people experience me. And this gap between self-perception and external perception is universal. And left unexamined, it can become a leadership blind spot. Leaders often say things like, "I'm open to challenge." And their teams tell me, "Yeah, not so much, doesn't really like being questioned." The leader might say, "I fully empower my team." And the team will tell me, "Yeah, when things get messy, she steps in and takes over." Leaders will say things like, "I'm approachable." And leaders and teams say, yeah, they say they have an open door policy, but when you get there, the door's open, but they're too busy to deal with you. None of this is about intention. It's about impact. And leadership lives in impact. So after your next key interaction, ask yourself, if somebody described my leadership in one sentence today, what would they say? And be honest with yourself. Try not to say what you hope they would say, but what they actually would say, what they likely experienced. Perception repeated over time becomes reputation. Reputation is leadership memory. It answers the question, what's it like to work with this person when nobody's watching? Reputations form through consistency. One brilliant meeting does not create a reputation. And similarly, one bad moment doesn't destroy one. So forgive yourself for those days when things don't go according to plan. Patterns build reputation. This means that leadership is not about that one occasional performance. It's about daily signals. It's about small behaviors repeated consistently. They shape how you are known and who you become known as. And how you're known determines how people respond. Remember the leader that I mentioned earlier on who said that he felt that his team had already decided who he was? Well, he was right. But over 9 months of consistent behavioral change, slowing his pace, listening more, interrupting less, creating clearer boundaries, his reputation shifted. And at the end of the year, a team member said to him, "You're not the same leader you were when you joined." Well, he was, but he'd managed to rewrite his reputation, not quickly, but powerfully. Most leaders fear feedback on how they're perceived because perception feedback threatens identity. But perceptual courage, the willingness to see yourself as other people see you, is one of the highest leadership capacities. And it takes courage. It takes so much courage to ask, how do you experience me in meetings? But that question opens more growth than just about any leadership course you'll ever go on. And paradoxically, leaders who invite perception feedback are perceived as more confident and not less confident because they signal security. So one of the things that you can do is you can find yourself a trusted colleague and ask them, when I'm under pressure, what do you experience from me? The difficulty here is to listen without defense, to listen honestly and recognize that you've asked the question, you've invited a response, have the grace and the maturity and the confidence to listen. This is perceptual mastery in action. So having now looked at episodes 1 and 2, where episode 1 was about inner leadership, about story, needs, nervous system, emotional inheritance, and episode 2 has been about perceptual leadership, signals, attribution, biases, and reputation. So let's bring them together. Your inner world creates your signals. Your signals create perception. Perception creates response. And response shapes results. Inner leadership without perceptual awareness becomes self-focus. Perceptual awareness without inner leadership becomes manipulation. Mature leadership integrates both. Know yourself and know how you're experienced. This is leadership wisdom. Every time you walk into a room, there are two leadership conversations going on. One inside you, your story, your state, your needs, and one inside the other people in the room. Their projections, their expectations, their judgments. So today we've explored the perception game, that leadership isn't about what you intend, it's about what other people experience. That presence arrives before content, that perception shapes reality, that reputations are built in small moments. In our next episode, we'll go even deeper still, because beneath perception lies a more primal force, power. Why do people follow some leaders willingly and resist others instinctively? So in episode 3, we'll explore that power, the invisible force beneath every relationship. Until then, remember that you're not only leading from who you are, you're leading from who other people believe you to be. But before we go, here are your top 5 takeaways from today's episode. Number 1, observe your first 5 minutes. Record yourself presenting. Notice your posture, your pace, your tone. Are you making eye contact? Number 2, ask one perception question per week. Like, how did that land for you? Number 3, identify one habitual signal. Are you interrupting? Are you rushing? Are you avoiding silence? Experiment with changing them. Number 4, map your credibility triangle. Competence, trust, and care. Which is strongest? Which one needs attention? And finally, number 5, invite perceptual feedback. Ask one trusted person how they experience you under pressure. Remember that small shifts in perception create large shifts in leadership impact.
Remember to subscribe to the Power in Excellence podcast.
That's it for me for today. I'll see you in episode 3 of The Unseen Advantage or elsewhere in the Power in Excellence podcast series. Remember, you can message us on WhatsApp at +44 7860 625 551 or email podcast@powerinexcellence.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye.